Hi, folks. I hope you're all doing well. I apologize for the darkness here, but I did want to quickly go over the final exam study guide and just give you some kind of more focused points to study. I know the study guide is really long. We covered a lot this summer semester, so I wanted this to be an opportunity to point out some things that you should really be focusing on. So I'm going to look at the study guide. If you want to follow along with me, I'm going to go from chapter to chapter. While I'm doing that, I'm also looking at the questions on the exam so I can give you kind of a really as straightforward as I can tips on what you should be studying. So the first chapter is 1.1. 1.1 covers line. We talked about line pretty extensively. So we touched on continuous line, contour line, and just in general, what line can do to kind of change the mood of a painting. So pay attention to the specific artists that use line to evoke a sense of feeling or just kind of push their agenda forward, right? And then also in this chapter, we talked about Carrie Mae Weems and her use of contrast. And so there's going to be a question on that. Chapter 4.8 is about art of protest and social conscious. That's another chapter we went pretty in detail about. So there's a few artworks in that chapter that I want you to pay attention to. There is Teresa Margulies' En el aire, so in the air. There's also that artwork about guns for shovels and some of the social circumstances around that. There's also Migrant Mother by Dorothea Lange in that chapter, Sherelle Rowland, The Jumpsuit Project. So these are artworks that you'll want to study for sure. Let's see here. After that, we went into chapter 1.1, engaging with form and content. So there are some questions about analysis and what types of analysis, what they are basically. So study that one page of what types of analyses there are and what they're useful for. There is one question about Robert Mapplethorpe, so definitely look into his work. Let's see here. There is a couple questions about Las Meninas, and so you'll definitely want to read about that artwork. There is, let's see here. Okay, and I think that's about it for that one. Chapter 2.2, painting. So I didn't include a question about Jose Clemente Orozco. I just didn't like the way it was written, so you don't need to cover that. But fresco painting is really good to know. Egg tempera, you don't need to know that one as much. And the same with linseed oil. I didn't go that detailed into that. Binder is really important to think about, and then pigment also is not on the study guide, but pigment is something, I think there's one question about pigment in there. And then there is a question about a muralist, and I'm trying to see if I can give you any more specifics about that. There's one question about Danza de la Tierra by Judy Baca, so you could just refresh your memory on that. That's in that same chapter. Okay, chapter 3.8. There's like 3 questions about Edvard Manet's Les Déjeuners sur la Hève. So definitely take a look at that, Luncheon on the Grass. This painting was so scandalous at the time. There's just a lot to be said about it. It was quite shocking, so definitely read about that piece. Also realism. I think realism is a really important area for a number of different reasons, but I'm thinking of Gustave Courbet's Stonebreakers. And yeah, there's a question about that. There is a question about Thomas Leclerc, Interior with Portraits. There's of course a couple questions about Impressionism. There's one question about Vincent van Gogh's Starry Night, and 2 questions about Vasily Kandinsky's improvisation number 30. For the Vincent van Gogh question, the question is about the technique that he used. So I know there's a lot about that artwork, so I don't want you to go overboard. Just know what technique he used to paint that. And okay, let's keep going on. So chapter 4.6, of course, there's a question about Kehinde Wiley, Napoleon leading the army over the Alps. There is then a question about Elizabeth Louise Vigée-Lebrun, Marie Antoinette and her children. There's a question about that because that painting is so fascinating to me. So read about that painting and the relation of that painting to the Queen of England. So that's a really important one. And then the next section, oh, I didn't include any questions about Jacques Louis David Napoleon crossing the Alps, and I didn't include a question about Communist Party leader Mao Zedong, so you can take those out. Okay, chapter 4.1, art and community. Of course, the definition of community art, I have a couple questions about that. There are a couple questions about The Gates by Christo and Jean-Claude, because those are really amazing artists that we didn't get a chance to dive into in our Zooms, but there's a couple questions about them. And then there is a question about the Yoruba Gelede rituals. And then there is a question about the Tijuana projection. Okay, I'll make a side note at the end of this. Chapter 3.9, let's see here. Okay. Chapter 3.9, there's a question about Frida Kahlo being a part of the Surrealist movement. There's a question about Andy Warhol using commercial processes. There is a question about Roy Lichtenstein and how he uses color. There's also another question about Roy Lichtenstein and just the traditional notions of subject matter and being a professionally trained artist. Let's see here. And then there are, of course, questions about Marcel Duchamp's bicycle wheel, but I'm not seeing them in order right now. So I might have to come back to that. But there's definitely questions about Duchamp's bicycle wheel and ready-mades. Yeah. Okay, 3.5, Art of the Americas. Okay, Art of the Americas, I did narrow it down, so it's not the whole chapter that's in here. I'm mostly touching on the Mayans, the Olmec, and the Native American basket weavers. I lost my place. 1 second here. Scroll back up. Okay. There is a question that touches on the mirrors that were used as a form of protest at the Dakota Access Pipeline. I know we touched on that at one point in our classes. Okay, I think for the Art of Americas, again, I'm looking at my list of the questions and I think they might have gotten a little out of order, but I mostly touched on, like I said, the Mayans, the Olmec, the Native American basket weavers. There's a couple questions about the Aztecs as well, specifically Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess, and then the sculpture of Coatlicue. So that's in there too. Okay, the next one is color. Color, I went pretty light with this section. There is a question about a spectrum. There's a question about the keywords color, hue, vibrancy. Those are questions to look at. And of course, knowing the primary colors, that's super important. Okay. And then chapter 1.5, motion and time. This one I touched on pretty much everything that I listed. There is a question about suggested movement. There's a question about motion and time and just what those mean. There's a question about the passing of time in an artwork. Let's see here. And then, oh, there are three, I think 2 or 3 questions about performance art. So make sure you're familiar with performance art. And then there are a couple questions about, I'm blanking on the name of that painting right now, but the painting where the dog is like walking and the legs, you can see the legs like moving. That's one of the first paintings that depicts motion. So that's a really important one to look at. And then there's a question about Ai Weiwei and what he's dropping. Okay, chapter 2.9. For this one, it's important to know the difference between film and video. It's important to know what was happening before films were a thing. So how is it that we got from static images to film? That's really important. There's a question that touches on Edvard Muybridge's experiments with motion, where he takes photographs of a horse and notices that at one point the horse's legs are off the ground, right? So that was a really big invention at that time. There's 2 questions about film genres, so be familiar with those. Let's see here. About the overlap of video and art. Let's see here. Okay, and in the next one, 3.10, this one is about conceptual art. There's a question about what is conceptual art. There's a question, of course, about Joseph Kosuth's 1 and 3 chairs. There's a question about Ana Mendieta. 2 questions about Ana Mendieta. There's a question about Shirin Neshat. A question about Tara Donovan's Untitled. We didn't talk about that one, but it's a part of like installation artwork, so I wanted to include that. Okay, I think we can move on from that one. Oh, there's a question about Gabriel Dawes' Plexus number 19 and Mel Chin's Operation Pater $100 bill project. Okay, and then the next one, Spirituality and Art, chapter 4.2. It talks about spirituality, of course, Greek artists and why they made artwork, of course, like Buddhist art and what it's about, traditions in African cultures having to do with spirits. There's a couple questions about Senufo and that mother and child figurine. That's pretty like strange, but like has a really important purpose. There's a question about Muslim practice. There's a lot of questions in this section because I thought y'all would do really well with those because we went over it a lot. There's a question about religion, which religion emphasizes the natural elements. Okay, and then chapter 3.3, Art of India, China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. There's a question about Chinese scrolls, a question about the Japanese art of ukiyo-e, pictures of the floating world. There's a question about that piece, The Great Wave Offshore of Kanagawa. There's a couple questions about that. And let's see here. So there's only one Buddhist question, so don't go overkill with that. Same with China, there's only one question I think about the scrolls. And then that's about it from that section. Okay, chapter 3.1. Chapter 3.1 is also a little bit slim in terms of like amount of questions. There's questions about Egyptian pharaohs and what happens to them when they died. There's questions about paintings in Egyptian tombs. There's a couple questions about Christian artwork and a question about what iconoclasm means. That one was really important. So I'm going into chapter 3.2 now, actually. There's a question about Gothic architecture, specifically the buttresses that they mentioned. There's a couple questions about those. Okay, and then I didn't really include much on pilgrimage in the Middle Ages. Okay, chapter 4.3, Art in the Cycle of Life. I did talk about, there are some questions about art depicting birth scenes and motherhood, like the beginning of life, right? There is a picture, or there is a question about Serrano's Dead Christ image artwork. There's a question about vanitas, of course. Vanitas, Vanitas. Moving into the art of Africa and the Pacific Islands, there's a question about what is the African diaspora. There is a question touching on kente cloth, African masks, and objects made in Pacific Island cultures, the Maori face designs, and the Mao of Easter Island, the ancestors of Easter Island. Those are really important. Okay, moving into chapter 3.6. We have, that one's pretty slim too. So we're talking about, the questions are about Artemisia Gentileschi. So the artist who created the Judith decapitating Holofernes. So there's definitely a question about that. A couple questions about that. And that section, honestly, I did skim over because I felt that we didn't cover it as in depth as I would have wanted. I missed a class because of, I forget which class that was exactly, but I would have liked to distinguish more what is Byzantine art, what is Renaissance, what is high Renaissance, late Renaissance, but we didn't dive into it. And I think if you just read about it, it doesn't make sense as much. So anyways, there's only a couple questions about Gentileschi, Judith decapitating Holofernes. Okay, chapter 2.1, drawing. There's a question about the invention of paper. There's a question about how paper is made, what fibers are used to make it. And that section is mostly about paper. So focus on that one. Okay, and then lastly, chapter 4.4, art and science. That was what we covered today. So there's, of course, the artist George Seurat, Sunday on La Grande Jatte. There's a question about Jasper Johns' flag, Yayoi Kusama, Salvador Dali. And there is a question about using X-ray in artwork, especially for Singer Sargent's Madame X artwork. Okay, so that's it. Really quick to go through. I hope that it just helps kind of give you an edge and kind of helps you focus on your studying. And again, I'm so sorry about this dark video. I just really wanted to get it into you as soon as possible. So I'm going to upload this on YouTube. It's going to have captions, so I hope that helps a lot. And yeah, good luck studying, y'all. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention is that, so I listed that there's questions from this chapter, right? But there's a bank of about 100 questions. So you might get some questions that are more in one section than another section. That's just the nature of tests. That's just the nature of randomization. And so just be wary of that, right? That you should be prepared to answer questions from all of these, but that some questions, like you might have one question in the drawing section, 3 questions from the art and protest section. So just be aware of that when you're taking the test, that it's not chronological of when we covered it in the class. It's very much randomized. So yeah, go ahead and write a question in the Q&A forum if you have one, if you want to get with someone to study. You can also send me a private message too. So yeah, good luck y'all, and have a good evening. All right, take care.